you even begin? So say that you have like an offer, or you're a creator, a small business owner, and you really want to get onto a podcast. What does that look like? Where do you even begin the process of trying to find a podcast and that strategy of trying to get onto it?
The first thing I would do is I would actually think about why you want to get onto the podcast and what do you bring to the listener and to the podcaster. Because we quite often, we take these things from our own perspective. So I want to be on the podcast so that I can promote my book, so that I can tell people about this offer. The person or the people who are listening may or may not care. And so it's looking a little bit deeper than that and going, okay, well, what value am I bringing? What is my book about? What is my offer about? What is it that I can focus on that is going to be of interest to the audience? And what that means is that not only do you have to kind of question yourself, but when you're looking for podcasts, you need to do the research on them. You need to look at them. You need to read what they're about. You need to look at some of their previous episodes. You need to listen to an episode and really look to see how you fit with it and how you, can bring benefit. Because while ultimately you want benefit from it, you have to deliver benefit for that to actually happen. So that would be the first thing I would say, is always start by looking at what you can bring and what the people listening are going to get from it. In terms of searching for podcasts, there are lots of different ways. So one simple way is to actually just type in the subject, add the word podcast on Google, and hit search. And it'll come up with a whole bunch of podcasts. The other way is there are various different tools that you can use. So I use a number of them, and I'll show you a link to them afterwards, because you can look at that on the replay as well. But one of the ones that I use is something called Echo Jockey. Now, Echo Jockey is quite new, but what it does is allows you to search for podcasts by genre, by whether they have guests or not, where the people are located, what language they're in. And it gives you a whole bunch of information about those podcasts, including the listener numbers, and the genres again, the location. So all of that sort of information to help you to identify whether or not it's a good podcast for you. It's very AI based, so it'll also propose things for you, and that can be really useful. The other two that I tend to use are Listen Notes and something called Rephonic. Listen Notes is similar in terms of allowing you to search for podcasts and gives you a lot of information. It gives you a rating on some podcasts depending on how many episodes and how well they're doing. Rephonic, the main thing that I use it for is actually a cool little tool that they have, which is what they call a graph. I think that it's more of a mind map. And what you can do is you can take a podcast, or if you found a podcast that you think, I'm interested in this one, search for that one. And it will show you all of the related podcasts that other people listen to that are around that. So it's a great way to dig down and find other podcasts that you may or may not have come across otherwise. Because let's face it, if you knew the name of the podcast, you wouldn't be doing a hunt. This is a really good way to find it.
Okay, amazing. So with that kind of knowledge, you're going to find quite a few podcasts, I can imagine. They're in your niche and you think, okay, this one is relevant. How would you kind of whittle down and narrow down which podcasts to contact, and how many should you contact?
Okay, I'm a firm believer in not being on too many podcasts. And it's not that you can't go on lots of them, but not going on them in a short time frame. So you need to be realistic about the amount of time you have to put into it, not just the researching, but actually to be on the, doing the promotion afterwards, doing the recording, doing everything that you need to do to, be a good podcast guest. I also think that if you send out tons and tons and tons and tons, you're going to end up back in that spamming, because you're not going to have the time to really look at all of them and pin them down. So I would really look at the ones that stand out to you, that you think when you're reading it, go, yeah, you know what, that's quite interesting. And I'd like to I'd like to know more about it. Listen to the episode, or at least part of an episode, and go, yeah, actually, that sounds interesting. And I think I can relate to that person. Because a lot of, good podcast is going to be the chemistry between you and the interviewer. You need to resonate with each other. If you can't stand them and you hate their style of podcast and interviewing, you don't want to be on these podcasts. There's no point. I wouldn't look at the number of downloads or whether it's new or not, because I've got a stat. Actually, I'm not going to show it to you because it'll just distract us. But basically, Buzzsprout does some stats on a monthly basis. And to be in the top 50% of podcasts, and bearing in mind there are millions of podcasts, you need 28 downloads in the first 7 days. And that's it. 28 downloads. So we all tend to assume that a successful podcast has got to have, hundreds and thousands and millions, but 50%, 28 downloads. It amazes me every time I see it. I told this to Emma before, and I think I just kept repeating 28 then as well. So you're looking for people who haven't heard you before, or they've maybe only heard a little bit about you. And if there's 28 new people, that's 28 opportunities to build the know, like, and trust with those people. And if you go on another podcast and it's got 20 or it's got 100, then that's another X number of opportunities. So I would really be looking at what the podcast speaks to you about, what you can bring to that podcast, where you really think you can bring value, and that you can see that they are looking for quality guests, that they're not just taking anybody who lands on their doorstep. They're actually going, yeah, I want people who are a great fit. And then narrow down your list from there. And then again, just be sensible about how many you're going out to. Make sure it's a personalized email to them or contact, that it's something that tells them that you are paying attention, that you have looked at it, that you are thinking about their audience and why their audience would like to hear you. It's not thinking about you and what you'd like to talk about. Hopefully the two will become together, but it's about looking at it from their angle.
That's amazing. So you think that is the best way to then reach out is through email? You mentioned you'd kind of narrow them down. You think, okay, this looks like the perfect audience for me. I really like the whole energy and the direction of the podcast. Then what would be the next step? Would it be to kind of figure out, like you mentioned, what you'd bring to the podcast and then to reach out by email and kind of share that? Or is there like a specific way that has a higher conversion rate for reaching out and getting a spot on this podcast?
It really depends on the podcast. So some podcasts will have a form that they want you to fill in and apply via that route. And really, you could try and circumvent it and all of that, but for me, I think that they would just see that as spam, because again, they've said to you, this is how we want you to apply. And now you're going off and trying to sneak in via LinkedIn and all of that. So I would look for the way that they've asked to be contacted. If they've got a form, use the form. If they've provided an email address somewhere, then use the email address. If they don't provide any of that, and it can be difficult to find contact information, the different tools, some of them have visibility of emails. Some of them may or may not be the right email. They might actually be the original email that was put in when they set the podcast up. But if you can't find it, then consider the LinkedIns and Instagram or whatever other platforms they're on. But again, just be really considerate. It's unlikely that you are the first person to write to them. So be conscious that you want to value their time, and you want to value their podcast and what they're doing, and making sure that it's of value all around. And don't be surprised if you don't hear back. Some people, everybody's podcast is different. Some of them are things that people are doing as an aside. Some of them are massive. They've got, hundreds, thousands of people applying for them. You might just go into a black hole, but don't let it put you off. leave it on your list and know, yeah, I wrote to them. Do I follow up with this one, or do I just leave it in there? Do I wait 6 months and apply again? Just decide based on the podcast and what you can see about it and what you know. And bear in mind that the lead times can be quite long. So my podcasts, most of them that are registered specifically with me, the average from an initial contact with them to them actually releasing an episode is 3 months.
Wow.
So yeah, and that's the average, which means that some are longer. I have one podcast at the moment where we made the introduction at the beginning of August, and they have now said that they will come back to us early in the new year to see whether or not they want to go ahead with this guest or not. So they basically have said, we finished recording season 1. We'll start doing season 2 in the new year. And, so we have no idea when or if they'll come back. They've expressed an interest, but again, it's a long lead time depending on what they're doing.
I'm with you. So say that they do accept you and you're like, okay, I've got the spot and it's booked in for this time. Would it be free, or do you sometimes have to pay to go on to maybe bigger podcasts? And how would you kind of decide if it is paid, if that's the right kind of area for your marketing budget?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I personally don't think you should pay, and I don't think they should ask for payment, because what happens then is it changes the dynamic, because suddenly I am now paying for this opportunity and we're back to it being about me and what do I want to get out of it. So it's like this, if you'd said, Deborah, do you want to do this masterclass? And I'd said, yes, and here's how much it'll cost you. I'm suddenly, the other way around, I'm paying you to be on it. I'm suddenly going, well, hang on, I'm paying to be on this. So I don't care so much about what the listeners want. I want to tell them what I want so I can get a return for the money that I've spent. Just to be clear, everybody, I haven't paid. I'm not being paid. This is a collaboration. But it's that kind of balance between, the podcast interview is about giving value. I know I keep using the word value, but it's really valuable. So it should be a free-flowing conversation that goes where you both agree that it should go. There are also rules, and I'll be honest, I do not know the ins and outs of it, but there's a balance as well in terms of what is advertising and what do you actually then need to tell people that this is paid for and it is advertising. So it's the same as if you put an affiliate link up, that you need to tell people it's an affiliate link. If somebody's paying to be on your podcast, you need to, mention that. So always down to personal decisions. If somebody comes and says to you, this is how much it'll cost, you can weigh up, whether you want to spend the money or not. I don't think you need to. That's my honest answer. There are loads of other ones out there. So unless it's really going to do something amazing for you, I just wouldn't.
How would you know if it was a success? So say that you're on a podcast, what would be the kind of metrics that you'd be looking for, and how would you even measure the success of the podcast?
It's really difficult. So basically there's multiple ways that people can listen to a podcast. So they can listen to it on Apple, they can listen on Spotify, they can listen on Acast, and there are tons of different apps out there. And they don't necessarily share their listening and download statistics with one another. So while they're out there and they can be combined, they're not necessarily that visible either to the podcaster themselves or to you individually. Some of those tools I mentioned do have some download figures and things like that, so you can look at those. They tend to be paid for if you're looking for more of that detail. I personally look at it from the perspective of, I put out a call to action, because you'll put out a call to action as part of the podcast. At the end of it, you say your little bit and it'll go into the show notes. Make sure that where you've pointed them is somewhere that you can identify as being from you. and from that podcast. So don't just give out the normal landing page that you would normally do. Give out a different landing page that can show, okay, yeah, actually, they got that link from being on that podcast. When you share their episodes, do, a Bitly or one of those equivalent of them and put some, the UTM onto them so that you can go, actually, I can't see who downloaded it in terms of, the detail of the overall podcast, but I can see how many people clicked on my link. So it's really doing a little bit of research, and bearing in mind that it is a slow burn. Unless you happen to just hit the nail on the head for somebody, they're unlikely to be, running off and, immediately signing up for everything. So it might take some time to come through. And for me, again, I think that's fine. It's about building your credibility, building your authority so that people start to go, oh yeah, I saw that Emma. And I saw her over there as well. And actually, you know what? I really liked her. So what is it she does? She was talking about, my social media and how to promote things. I'm going to look her up. So it's building that relationship gradually.
So would you recommend kind of creating like a landing page and a special offer maybe for podcast listeners and then like have a special code? Would that be a decent strategy or?
Yeah, you could do that. So as you say, something with a special code would mean that you don't necessarily need a separate landing page because they put the code in and you go, oh yeah, that's from this podcast. Or, you can set up landing pages so easily now. If you've got an email system, a lot of those have, landing page or web page builders. So you could, again, just do a simple, page for it. It doesn't have to be a special offer for them. There's always something nice that makes people feel special that they got a special offer. But if it's not relevant, then don't worry about it.
Amazing. And then you're on the podcast, so you've done it, you've secured the great one, you've got your offer that you want to promote, and you know how you're going to track it. How do you even know what to talk about? How do you know how much to kind of sell? How do you know how much to go into your personal life? How do you kind of prepare for questions that you maybe didn't want to answer? What does that look like?
So part of it is back to your research. So you've gone through the research, you've looked at the podcast, you've looked at the type of podcast that it is, you've looked at the topics. If possible, and this doesn't always happen, but if possible, I would recommend having a conversation with the podcaster in advance. Now, ideally, that would happen before you meet for the interview, but if not, then hopefully there'll be a few minutes before the interview starts that you can just clarify where you're going. Be really clear with your boundaries in terms of, if there is a topic that you really don't want to discuss, tell the podcaster. So one of the things that I used to do with my podcast is I would ask them, what do you want to talk about? Is there anything you want to avoid? Because of all of the things that I wanted to do, I wanted to hear people's, stories of pain because my, Bridging Gaps was all about people's journeys and the, the reality is that running your own business gives you a load of rubbish at times. So I wanted that pain. But I didn't want to take somebody somewhere that they didn't want to go. So don't hesitate to, say to them up front, I'm not happy to talk about this. And if they ask you a question that you really don't want to answer a different question. We see politicians, they're brilliant at this. Somebody asked them question A, which we all really, really, really want to know the answer to, and they answer question X that we actually were unaware of. But by the time they've answered it, we've all forgotten about question A, and we've just given up hope. Obviously, I don't want you to have your listeners giving up hope, but just answer a different question. Use it as a start point, and then lead into something else. So, okay, well, Emma's just asked me about going to Mexico, and I don't know why that would be a painful conversation for me, but something, it's interesting about Mexico. I actually prefer Penticton in Canada.
Nice.
So just kind of nicely diverting people to what you want to talk about. And if it's really awkward and they really persist, you can always say, actually, do you know what? I'm not comfortable talking about that.
That's good. To set like clear boundaries.
Yeah, because the podcast is it should be mutually beneficial. It's not all about them and it's not all about you. In reality, it's all about the listener. And you both need to be happy though in what you're delivering to them.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know, because I think that can be a fear for a lot of people, especially if you're not practiced in public speaking, or if you're kind of an introvert or maybe a bit shy, you might be hesitant to kind of share your message and your story on a podcast. Is there anything that you could do to prepare for that? Would you recommend practicing like in the mirror or with friends or any way? Because it is nerve-wracking to speak in front of a large group of people.
Yeah, it is. So one advantage is that most of the time you're only talking to the podcaster, the interviewer. So you don't necessarily feel like you're standing in front of a large group of people, but there's still that knowledge that it's out there. It's, available to anybody to listen to. I think that there is a benefit to thinking about what you want to say and what your objective is, and to being clear on what the message is that you want to deliver. Now, I'm laughing here actually because Simon is actually a member of Match Meet a Podcast, and he gave a talk for us a couple months ago. And this is one of the things he was saying about being clear about what you're talking about, and telling people why you're telling them it. I don't think you should practice to the nth degree, because what happens is you get stale. You just know, you're just reciting it now. And there's something about that freshness and being able to be open and to be honest and to go down a path that you maybe didn't expect, as long as you are keeping on the right path. So do a little bit of practice, but don't rehearse, if that makes sense. Just think about the message you want. Have some bullet points if that helps you as well, to go, yeah, these are the key things I want to bring out. And remember, keep them short, because people can only take in so much. If you have a story that takes an hour and a half to get to the point, you're going to have lost everybody. So keep it back to, and if you've got multiple points to make in the podcast, and that's brilliant as well. Oops. Sorry, I just hit my laptop.
So what about, okay, so you know what to talk about, you've got your offer, you're prepared. What about if it's a podcast that involves travel? What if it's not even in your city or even in your country? Who fronts the cost for that? Would it be yourself or would it be the podcast? How do you arrange this? Especially if it's like an important podcast for you and you think, okay, well, maybe it would be worth going to Texas for example.
It's completely up to you. If the podcast is important enough to you that you think, yes, actually, I really want to be on this, I think there's going to be a huge benefit, you might choose to fund that yourself. If you're not sure or you can't afford it, then you could, ask them to fund it and see what they say. You could do it remotely. Loads of podcasts now are done remotely, so you don't have to be in the same location. But really, it's going to be your decision on what you're willing to do. You could go, well, actually, I could pay for it, but I'm going to ask them if they want to pay. Well, not want to, but if they will. And if they say no, then you decide. So it's really, up to you.
Okay, and would you say that it would be good to maybe be on a podcast maybe once a month or once a year, especially if there's travel involved? Like, what do you think would be a good kind of number of podcasts to be on, volume-wise?
I think if you can be on one a month, then that's giving you a nice turnover in terms of you can go out to your audience and say, hey, this month I was on such and such a podcast. And, have a listen. Here's what it's about. Here's what they took from it. If you're on more, it's not necessarily bad, but it's just about managing and remembering, again, depending on the podcast, but most of the podcasts you're going to go on are going to be relatively small. So part of your job is to tell your listeners and your audience about it. So if I go on a podcast every day, my email list is going to just be clicking unsubscribe because they'll be like, Deborah, how many times can I hear you talk? They're just not going to engage anymore. So you want to balance that benefit of you delivering for the podcaster and also delivering for yourself. So I would try and balance it. Once a year, I think it isn't often enough. The other thing to remember is that the podcast itself is typically evergreen. So unless you're talking about something which is very topical and, does have a short life, normally the messages and the stories that you're telling, they live on. So you can keep promoting it. You can tell people about it, a year down the road and go, hey, did you listen to me when I was on this podcast? Or, there's this little section, listen to this clip because it's really valuable to what we're talking about today. So really making the most of that appearance will help it live longer, even if you're not on, tons of them. And I think it's more important to be on podcasts that are good for you than to just be on a podcast. So, if I'm going to be on tons of them and most of them don't have the right audience for me and I'm not actually the right person for them, then we're just wasting everybody's time.
So say that you are really going for it and you've applied to them and then they all get back to you. Let's just say that like everything goes well and everyone's like, I would love for you to be a guest. And you're like, yes, I've done it. And then you're like, okay, well, do I speak about the same thing on every podcast? Do I have the same kind of message, or do I need to switch it up? Do I need to tell different stories? Because I remember when Matthew McConaughey released the book a few years ago, and I saw him doing the podcast rounds. I think he was maybe doing a podcast a day, but he was just talking about his book and the stories in his book and his childhood. They were always very similar, and this book became like a #1 bestseller. And it kind of was counterintuitive for me because I thought he's just saying the same thing over and over again, but it seemed to work. So I don't know whether it was because it was Matthew McConaughey and it was a book, or whether that's good advice to do that.
And I think that comes down to who you are. Matthew McConaughey, they're not necessarily expecting that he's going to go off and email all of his fans to say, by the way, I was on this podcast. The podcasts are going to be the ones that are going out saying, hey, we had Matthew on it. So it's a very different situation because they want him to be on it and they're not necessarily expecting him to be anything other than a great guest. So they're not relying on his reach. They're relying on his fame to automatically draw interest in. Whereas if it was me and I'd written a book and I kept saying the same things, then yes, the people who are listening to the podcast are fine because they're probably not the same people. But if I'm doing my bit and I'm writing to my list, they're all going to be, Deborah, you just said that. Deborah, you just said that. And it's looking at who you are, looking at what you're delivering, looking again at the value for everybody, and also looking for different stories. So, when you go through, before you start approaching people and you start pulling out these stories, look at the different angles and aspects that you could talk about. Maybe you have a different way of demonstrating the same thing. Maybe you have a different story about how you achieved something, or, life was rubbish and that happened multiple times. So on one podcast, you say, yeah, well, this happened. And the next one you say, and then this happened. So just think about how you can differentiate it and how you can bring additional information and additional interest to the listeners and the podcaster.
That's a perfect answer. Thank you. I think that I've got a ton more questions, but I know that maybe some of you might have your own questions that are very specific to where you're at in your journey right now, wanting to be a podcast guest or looking for podcasts, or maybe even thinking about becoming a podcast host. So if you want to type your questions in the chat, then that would be great, and Deborah will answer them directly. And if not, I can just keep going by. Or you can even unmute yourself and ask the question live if you want to practice being on the podcast.
Just while we're waiting to see if anybody wants to pop any in. One of the things that I look at when podcasters are registering with me, so I have a mixture of people who have registered and I built a relationship with, and people who are more cold outreach where I'm doing the research and looking for the fits. And the ones who register, the thing that they most request, so I give them a list of, what's important to you and a guest. The most important quality is a good fit with their audience. So it really kind of shows when you're looking at the podcast to make sure that you are saying, do I fit with your audience? And the next thing they like, and these are again mainly smaller podcasts, is that you will promote the episode. So those are some things to take into account.
It's very helpful. We've got a question from Sue. She says, with so few downloads, is working for a podcast worth the time and effort?
Can I just clarify, Sue, do you mean having your own podcast or being a guest on a podcast with few downloads? Feel free to unmute and just answer if you'd rather, Sue.
She says guest.
Okay. I think it is. I did a poll a few months ago on LinkedIn, and I said to people, how many people have to be in a networking meeting for you to feel that it was a success? And the answer was between 10 and 15. So most of the time, well, some networking's online, but in person, you're getting yourself there, you're going out, you're talking to people, and 10 to 15 people is successful. And not all 10 of those, not all 15 of those will necessarily become clients. They will just have learned a little bit about you. And that's worthwhile. So if you're getting more than that, I definitely think it's worthwhile. And it also can go on your website. It can go everywhere. There's lots of things where you're going, hey, I was a guest over here. I was a guest over here. And people are going, oh, well, she's obviously really interesting. People want to hear from her. So short answer is yes, but I'm not very good on short answers, you may have gathered.
Thank you. That was really good because it's true. Like the best networking events that we've been to, it's like you focus on a few people and then you build a relationship with them, and the podcast is the same, right? So we've got another one from Lindsay. She says, this isn't really about being a guest, so feel free to not answer it if you prefer. I have a YouTube channel. Is it worth putting this out as a podcast as well?
It depends. If your YouTube channel relies heavily on the visuals, then I wouldn't. And the reason for that is there are more and more, you'll hear and see video podcasts now, but a true podcast will be available in both formats. Well, it may or may not be available as video, but it will be available audio only. So most of the listening platforms are just that, audio only, though I know Spotify's just launched videos as well. So if it relies on the visuals, people are just going to be frustrated. They're going to be there going, okay, you're telling me to look at this, and I can't look at this because I'm just listening. If it doesn't rely on those, then absolutely put it out as a podcast as well, because it gives you a whole different range of potential listeners. There are millions of listeners out there, like no exaggeration, millions and millions of listeners. And you only need a teeny percentages, like 0.1%, possibly even 0.01% to, put your numbers up and everything like that. So yeah, just look at that. Consider whether it's going to work for people or not. And if you do some visuals, just describe it. So if you're saying, well, actually, do you know what? I've just been looking at this phone and I want to tell you that, I can tell that it's quite small. It fits easily into my hand. So you're telling the listener a little bit more about it. You don't have to describe it in intimate detail, because there's something, for me anyway, about one of the power of a podcast is it also allows you to use your imagination. So I remember doing a talk once, and it was about podcasting, and I told everybody a story about the dog that I borrowed, and then we were talking about it, and everybody had heard the same story, but depending on who they were, they had a completely different picture in their head. to what that dog looked like. If they knew Woody, they obviously knew exactly what he looked like. If they had their own dog, then their version of Woody probably looked similar to their dog. If they didn't like dogs, they were probably just frowning at me and thinking, why is she talking about dogs? But it's nice to have that imagination because they didn't need to know exactly what dog I was talking about and exactly what he looked like. That was just a sort of ancillary bit to the story. So I like that degree of imagination that the podcast frees people up to have as well. So I'm giving you I know, slightly contradictory, if you've got visuals, don't do it, describe it, but it's getting that right, the balance right.
I think that, some of the best podcasts, I know the bigger ones like Joe Rogan, they'll be watching something on the screen and then they'll say, oh, for anybody listening, and nobody cares, So it's like, it's a good way to get around it. We've got another question as well from Simon. I've seen your question, Simon. It says, if I'm chopping up the audio for social media posts to market podcasts, etc., is there an AI that will find sensible breaks for me? Yes, I know, I'm lazy.
No comment there, Simon. There is AI. There are various tools, and let me see if I can remember. So there's CapCut.
I've got one as well.
Thank you.
Simon, I've been testing them out a few as well because I've been doing a lot of follow us on TikTok, guys, at SmarterQ. I've been doing a lot of TikToks for us. I've just got going on this, and we've got all of this great content that I want to chop up. And a leading one that I found is called Opus AI, and it kind of scared me a little bit of how good it was. It was a bit dodgy because I'm in Mexico and it thought I was in the UK, so it kind of like wasn't that great for that. But like logistically wise, like if you're not moving around a lot like I am, I would check out Opus AI. Just search for it on the App Store, and you can just upload any video, and it will chop up the best bits, and it was pretty good.
There are loads of them out there as well. I have heard of Opus AI as well. The one thing I would say is just don't blindly rely on it. So I used one, I can't remember which one it was. I was just testing it out. And it might have been Submagic actually. And it did a great job of cutting it up. And it said, oh, here are the things to talk about. And I said, oh, that's great. And it did some automatic captioning and they were pretty good as well. And then it said to me, would you like to add a B-roll? And why not? And so off it went and it added in, all of these sort of pictures and things. I had no idea what it thought I was talking about. But those pictures had nothing to do with the content. So just, make sure you check it before you put it out there. And sometimes you'll find one that does just enough, and then you have to do a bit more, to it yourself, but that's still saving you time.
Oh, great. Has anyone else got any questions on podcasting? I know that maybe if you don't want to speak up, you can type it in the chat.
I have a question.
Go for it, Joel.
What's your take, if you know about Google's latest Notebook AI, where you can feed in any body of text and it'll generate a fake AI podcast with two people chatting? Have you heard about this?
I have not, and I'm slightly horrified. I have heard about, fake voices and people doing calls where they sound like you. So calling your parent or whatever and asking for details. The whole point of a podcast is to hear somebody talking. Sorry, so I want to hear that conversation. I want to hear the genuine reaction and emotion, whether it's a solo podcast or a conversation or a panel, and to have AI just, for me, what's the point? But obviously there will be people who like it and use it.
So it's about really the real stories, the real people that we tune in. We want to hear real stories.
Absolutely, because that's what it's all about. So no matter how far we've come with technology and, all of the things that our wonderful world can do, business and relationships still come down to know, like, and trust. I need to know who you are. I need to like you and I need to trust you. And if I'm listening to a podcast, I want to know that, I'm hearing your views. I'm hearing what you want to share and who you are and how you respond. And from that, I'll decide if I like you. I may or may not like you. And that's fine, because as we know, there are millions and millions of people in the world. And if all of them were our friends, well, we'd just be overwhelmed and you'd never get anything done, because you'd still be like, oh yeah, I haven't said hi to them for a few years. So, people will decide if they like you. And then once they know if they like you and they've been hearing your stories, whether it's through your posts, whether it's meeting you, whether it's hearing you on podcasts or videos, they'll start to build the trust. And from there, they'll then decide, yeah, actually, I want to, work with this person, or I'm happy to tell somebody else about them because I know, like, and trust them. Or in some cases, I have introduced people who have said, they're not my cup of tea, but they might be good for you. So yeah, it's all about the human interaction.
I agree. I think it's really important. And it's like you don't have those kind of natural breaks and pauses and jokes with this AI. And something that I wanted to cover before we've got any more questions, keep them coming in the chat, guys, is that if you're curious, you're like, okay, I've done this, I've maybe got the AI repurposing, because that's a big part of it afterwards, right? And what we touched on earlier is the promotion. So you've done the podcast, you've got everything, you've repurposed it, and you've got that actual content ready to go and to share. What you can do is, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So if you're not familiar with SmarterQ, this is the amazing tool that Claude, we're really lucky to have you here. Claude's created this. So if you want to jump to Claude at any point and can you see my screen okay, guys? Just say yes, or...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can do it.
Claude, basically, he was fed up. This is the story with Claude, and maybe you can even tell it if you want, Claude, rather than me butcher it. But Claude was fed up with Hootsuite and Buffer and a lot of the other social media management tools because they just weren't very good. And he was like, okay, I want to create something that really makes an impact on social media. So he's created this amazing social media management tool called SmarterQ. And what you can do is, once you've got your podcast clips and everything, and you're ready to go and you've got the videos, you can try SmarterQ out for free. And Deborah will share her code. It's going to give you an extended 30-day free trial. And what you can do is you can test it out. There's no credit card needed. And you can upload all of your podcast clips or your social media posts into here. And you can even create like a new category. So you could create a new category, for example, called like podcast repurposing. I hope I spelled that right because my son isn't the best. And then what that does, you can change the color as well, just make it like really clear so it's red. You can choose which social profiles that you want to post it to. And we have a lot more social media profiles than this. But just for the ease of use, this is my account. And then what would happen is you'd go onto a posting plan. You can add a time slot for this to automatically post however many times a week to whichever platforms that you want. So you don't need to manually go into the social media tool like Instagram, like TikTok, and schedule it natively. You can actually have a tool like this, which is what all of the top creators, all of the top business owners are using this now. So it automatically gets done. You can see what's working, and then use the analytics and make it better. So you can choose any time that your podcast repurposing clips to go out, and then you would basically create a post, which is great. We go on here. Let's just say that you wanted to put it on TikTok. You would add the video. I haven't got a video on here ready to go, and for time, I'm not going to show you through the whole thing. But you can add the caption here. You can add the TikTok settings if you're going to do it on TikTok. You can choose everything that you would need to natively do it, like the same. And you can even use our AI caption writer to get like the best caption, the best hashtags. There's so many things that you can do with this. If you're curious about this, what I would recommend is to use Deborah's code. I'm going to stop share my screen now and not go on about it too much. You can use Deborah's code. It's just in the chat here. Sign up, check it out, and see if you like it. Anything to say on SmarterQ, your baby, Claude?
That was lovely to see someone else describing it all. The one thing is just to piggyback what Deborah said herself. If your podcast is typically evergreen, that if it's not timely, you can just share it again and again. And that's probably one of the main reasons I built Smart Queue is I wanted a big library, a big bucket full of my content. So you take your podcast, all of the ones you've done, you chop it up into bite-sized clips, and you just throw them into the queue and in the library. And then, like the posting plan that Emma created a time slot, you create a couple of them a week, and then at those times, it will just pick up the latest post or the next post in the queue, send it out, put it back to the bottom. So you're constantly just going to be putting your content out there. And even if it goes out multiple times, you're getting multiple bites of the cherry. As Deborah said, even if you do the same podcast several times, different audiences will be hearing different things. And we found people post the same thing 10, 20 times, and every time they get another 100 likes. And on the 20th time, they got 1,000 because it went viral. So it's that recycling, that repurposing that fits in perfectly with having podcast content.
And I use it to, to do exactly that, not only for podcasts, but for all of my posts, because I came to the conclusion that I was not going to post on a regular basis under my own steam, and that it works better for me to actually sit down, create a whole bunch of content, and then to schedule it and to know that I've got enough in there that it'll just keep recurring, which means that I don't have to worry about it running out or I missed a week or anything. So I obviously I wouldn't be on here doing this with SmarterQ if I didn't like SmarterQ. But I found it's just made a big difference in having the different queues. And I'm in the process of going through all of my old podcast episodes from my podcast and putting together a throwback Thursday so that those will be scheduled to go out, strangely enough, on a Thursday. And again, once I've got enough of them, I know that I'll just start that scheduling and off it'll run without me needing to get involved.
So easy. And you can A/B and test which ones work as well. Yeah. So there's so much that you can do in there, guys. I'm curious. It's good to hear you talking about it, Deborah. I'm so happy.
Emma, shall I just show? I know we're coming up. I've got a couple of their QR codes, but just so people, if they do want to check out any of the links that I mentioned,
where they can find you, how they can connect with you. I'm sure that everyone's going to love you after this and want to reach out, and as well for the people that aren't here live that want the recording, definitely share your screen.
So let me just go ahead and hit that. There we go. So these are the tools that I mentioned at the beginning. So Echo Jockey uses AI. They are actively developing. So if you do look at it, I know that they're doing a huge amount of work on their AI tools and things like that. So I quite like that. Rephonic is great. This is a link to the graph teacher. This is free. It's really quite neat. It's the one that I said gives you all the interrelated ones. And listen notes. Sorry, I realized I obviously got only so far in typing because it says great for searching for. But it gives you loads of information about podcasts as well. And you can search by subject and you can get lots of information about listeners, distribution, that sort of thing, which is, again, just really helpful. Then the next one, sorry, I just have to now convince this that it can go to the next slide. Another tool which I didn't mention, but it's Podchaser. Now this does have search capabilities as well, but one of the things that it's great for is you can go in and you can add yourself as a guest in the credits for different podcasts, obviously ones that you've been on. And that just gives you another degree of authority and credibility, because if somebody searches for you, then they can go, oh, you were a guest. And they can also look at all of the podcasts you were guests on. Submissions are checked just in case you are tempted to go in and add yourself to a ton of podcasts. They do look to make sure that, your name is the one mentioned in the podcast as the guest. So that's a QR code for that one. And then finally, if you don't want to do it all yourself, then, feel free to get in touch with me for Match Made to Podcasts. And as I said, quality introductions, developing your pitches, a monthly group coaching call to really help you to be the best guest you can be. And that's from all different angles. That's from, preparing your pitches, from, what you do afterwards, how you share it, as well as being on the podcast itself. And if you want to just connect with me, then please check out, connect with me on LinkedIn.
It's incredible. Thank you so much. I'm sure that everyone's going to be reaching out to you.
Excellent. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Fantastic. So any more last questions? We've got 1 minute left before we go, guys. This is your chance. If you're shy, ask that question now. 1 minute left. Thank you, George. Good luck at your meeting.
I will personally take the opportunity. Deborah, you were incredible. I was absolutely thrilled to have you share your time and knowledge with us. Absolute expert and a wonderful person, so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bob. Much appreciated.
That was fantastic. I loved it. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Okay. I think, thank you everyone for joining us. I really appreciate you sharing your energy and time with us today. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn and connect with Deborah. Great. Over and out, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care.